off for a moment because I have bandwidth issues and also streaming cold, so I don't want anybody to catch it.
Oh, yes. Oh, dear.
It's okay. There we go. I've gone again. Hurrah. We'll give it a couple of minutes to see if a couple more people are coming, and then we'll get started.
Fine, no problem.
You're looking good at your end.
Oh, good. Well, that's good. Metaphorically, I'm sure.
Quite the opposite.
Oh, bless.
Where are we? So, hi to Jenny. Hi, Joy. What we'll do, Gail, is give you the floor, and then maybe 15-20 minutes left. I'll give you a nudge so that there's time for people to ask questions.
Okay. I've got it written down in front of me, and I've got a clock in front of me that doesn't strike, which is good.
Don't worry about the chat box, because I'll keep an eye on the chat box so you can concentrate on what you're doing.
Yes,
and
yes.
So if people are asking any questions or got comments in the chat box, I'll make sure that they get through to you before the end.
Good. I've got a couple of pages of resources, you know, which will point people in the right direction. I'm happy for people to have my email. That's not a problem.
That's very kind.
No, I'm more than happy to. And if anybody wants any research done, that's fine by me too. So, you know, to try out some. Yeah.
Okie Right, let's get going. So, everybody, welcome on what where I am is very, very wet indeed, but that's not going to put us off for what I'm sure is going to be a very, very bright hour. Can I introduce you to Professor Gail Kinman? I had the privilege and joy of working with Gail in Ireland over the summer and knew that she just had to come and do us a webinar. So without further ado, I'll shut up and say welcome to Gail. Please turn your microphones off until we finish doing the presentation, and then there'll be an opportunity for questions at the end. So without further ado, Gail, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Steve, for that introduction, and hello to everybody. Obviously, I can't see you, but I know you're out there somewhere. So I'm going to be talking about the research that I've been doing in the university sector, and I just calculated that it was over 20 years ago I first started, which is a bit scary. So over that time, I've done some quite substantial national studies. So I'm going to be talking about those, and also discussing the implications of the findings for interventions and change, which I'm sure will be relevant to all of you. So I'm just going to move on now to a summary. Okay, so first of all, focusing on the changing academic landscape. Obviously, there's been a lot of changes in the sector over the last few decades. Just a quick summary of those. Then I'm going to be talking about the importance of using a benchmarking approach to monitor well-being in the sector. Certainly institutions do tend to use a bit of a pick and mix approach in terms of doing this. So I'm going to be setting out what a benchmarking approach is and using my own research to highlight the effects of that, looking at 3 particular surveys conducted since 2008. Then also carrying on with this benchmarking approach, we're going to be looking at levels of job satisfaction in the sector and also mental health. Now, some of you may well have read the really interesting article in the Times Higher a couple of weeks ago on this. So I've been measuring mental health again over the last 15 years or so in the sector. Then we're going to be looking at some other key issues that are particularly relevant, and this is the importance of a balance between efforts and rewards in underpinning well-being in the sector. Then looking at change management and something called change fatigue that maybe resonate with some of you, certainly, looking at the impact of the increasing number of roles that academics are meant to be fulfilling in the sector. Then a very important factor that I've been looking at for the last 20 years is work-life balance. So we're going to be looking at that. Then a new challenge to well-being, and this is something I've just started recently researching, and this is looking at the impact of technology. And there is evidence now that it can be a significant stressor, but obviously it can help us do the job better, but it can cause stress as well. Then we're going to be looking at some interventions, and I'm going to be arguing for a multi-level approach, because obviously most interventions in the sector are very much looking at the individual and expecting the individual staff member to change. But we need interventions from multiple levels, from public policy right the way down to the individual. And then I have a couple of pages of resources, and as I said earlier, I would really welcome anybody that wants to get in touch with me to discuss any of the work I've done. Right, let's move on. Okay, now I'm sure this will be very familiar to all of you. You know, the idea that the university landscape in the UK and in other countries like the USA and Australia has changed significantly over the last few years. Early research tended to see universities as a relatively low stress environment, and the idea was that the control and collegiality that was inherent in academic roles tended to protect people from stress. But of course, you know, clearly job control and collegiality has actually decreased. There has been rapid and wide-ranging change to all areas in the university sector, and that has challenged, you know, the job itself, but also the organisations that people work in. There's been a considerable intensification of work. This is really, you know, people are not necessarily working longer hours, but they're doing more in the working hours that they have. Rising demands and also a very fast pace of work. There's also rising student-to-staff ratios that have been documented over the last few years. There's very much a changing student profile where, you know, new types of students are actually coming into higher education that may need more input from staff, and also a greater use of customer service metrics like student satisfaction surveys, etc. Certainly research has documented an increasing managerialism in the sector, where high levels of bureaucracy and also demands related to administration, you know, completing forms, etc., much more than there used to be. Academics are certainly reporting that they have less control and influence in their universities, and also that is facilitated by this increasing reliance on metrics and audits, both within the university itself and also externally, like the TEF and the REF. There certainly has been growing casualisation and job insecurity documented, where an increasing number of academics are working on casual contracts and part-time, and they may not necessarily know whether their contracts will be extended at the end of the period. And certainly there is a sense of loss and disenchantment that's generally documented. And certainly there's been a recent study conducted by The Guardian and another organisation, suggesting that there is very low levels of optimism for the future, which obviously we do need to do something about this rising stress. So it's in this landscape that I'm going to be talking about my own research. So I'm just, for those of you unfamiliar with this, I'm going to be just giving you a very brief outline to the Health and Safety Executive Management Standards approach. So obviously we know that there is a bit of a problem in the university sector in this country, and there is a strong moral and business case for protecting the well-being of staff. Now, there are very many ways of measuring well-being, and certainly universities do tend to take, as I said, a pick and mix approach. But generally speaking, the Health and Safety Management Standards approach is the gold standard in this country. There's very many norms out there, lots of organisations and lots of sectors are following this approach. So essentially, it's a risk assessment process which kind of demystifies the whole idea of stress. And the idea is that you assess the risk in exactly the same way as any other type of risk to health and safety in the organisation. But this just happens to be psychological well-being. So we have 7 areas of work activity which have the potential for psychological harm, and these were actually decided upon after considerable discussions with lots of people in different areas like trade unionists, academics, researchers, universities, etc. So the general idea is that we have demands, which is to do with your workload, control, the extent to which that you actually have autonomy over what you do and when you do it. There's also support, the support that you get from managers, but also support from colleagues. Then we have the quality of the relationships in the organisation, and that also focuses on harassment and bullying, as well as the general quality of relationships. Then we have role, which is the extent to which you feel that your role is clear in the organisation and it fits in with the general aims of the organisation itself. And finally, change management, the extent to which management of change is communicated and managed well. So these 7 areas are very, very important. So I just now want to show you, sorry about the busyness of this slide, but this is illustrating my audit over 3 separate points of time since 2008. So this is looking at all of the 7 hazards you can see down the bottom: demands, control, support, relationships, role and change. So this is based on 3 waves of data collection from 2008, 2012 and 2014. And as you can see, you know, we have some very, very large sample sizes, which again is representative of people working in the sector. So the red column is the health and safety executive benchmark. But I do need to say that it's a little bit counterintuitive here, because higher scores represent high levels of well-being. So you can see that for every single dimension, apart from control, higher education does not meet the benchmark. And certainly we found that things are deteriorating over time, because demands, control and change have actually worsened over time. So, you know, this approach, as I'm sure you can see, is really valuable because it can give us a general picture of the sector as a whole, and it can also show us how we match up to the benchmarks. So as part of this approach, we asked the question, I find my job stressful. So we looked at the proportion of respondents that strongly disagreed to strongly agreed with this, again, in the 3 waves of data collection from 2008 to 2014. As you can see, there has been a fairly small, but nonetheless substantial and significant increase in the last wave of data collection. So as well as finding their jobs demanding and lacking in support, etc., we do have a situation where people are perceiving high levels of stress in their organisation. So just to continue to sell this benchmarking approach, if you like, using these validated measures with benchmarks from and norms from other organisations and sectors really do help us to monitor well-being in key areas over time. We can compare findings with other sectors if indeed we wish to do so. We can also use this at a national level to identify organisations at risk. And there may be particular functions within that organisation, like departments who are more risk than others. There may be profiles, like perhaps the more junior lecturer grades are worse off than the more senior grades, etc. And also there may be demographic factors, perhaps like age and gender. And I do also have to say that rather than use this to name and shame, which I tend to disagree with, we can use this to communicate best practice and highlight the organisations that are actually doing things well. And of course, the profile of findings that we get, we can use to inform targeted evidence-informed interventions. For example, if we want to reduce demands, we can then put an intervention in place, re-administer the measure, and then assess the impact over time. Now, as part of this research, we also benchmarked job satisfaction and mental health. So I'm just moving on now to report those findings. So I've just shown the positives and the negatives from this particular sample from 2014. What we found is, and this does tend to be a recurring effect in our research, is that overwhelmingly the highest level of job satisfaction is with fellow workers, you know, colleagues, the collegial atmosphere, etc. Also job control, the freedom to choose your own methods of working. And this is a very important buffer for job demands, because people can cope generally with a fairly high level of demand, provided they have control to help them meet these demands in different types of ways. The amount of variety in the job is also important too. But if we then look at the red column on the right, we can see the top sources of job dissatisfaction. And certainly the lower levels of satisfaction are to do with the way the organisation is managed. You know, satisfaction with senior management was actually very low. Chance of promotion was also low, and also industrial relations with management. Now, obviously, at the moment, we do have some union dispute going on, but I do need to say that this was conducted in 2014, so it does not reflect the current position. So this is just a general view of the positives and the negatives. Moving on now to mental health. Now, the measure of mental health that I've been using over the years is something called the General Health Questionnaire 12. And this, again, has been used in thousands of studies in different sectors, different job types, etc. And what this does is it identifies the proportion of your sample that scores at a particular rate. And above that rate, they're identified as caseness. So caseness essentially is the percentage of your sample that should actually have some intervention to improve their mental health. And the symptoms that are assessed are all, you know, very, very important indicators of mental health, like depression, anxiety, also cognitive impairment to do with memory, problem solving, etc., and sleeping problems. So we can see that 55% of my sample in higher education achieved a level of caseness, which is, you know, well over half. And this can be compared with other occupational groups that might be considered highly stressed, like police and the NHS. But I've also included prison officers here because I've just recently done some research with them, and, you know, they do have a considerably higher proportion of mental health problems. But certainly it is a cause for concern in higher education. Moving on now to a very different model, which I think is very useful for identifying interventions in universities. It's something called the effort reward imbalance model. And the general idea is that you have to, the efforts that people believe they put into work should be counterbalanced by the rewards that they receive. And any imbalance predicts health problems. Now, they could be physical health problems, they could be mental health problems. And the rewards are transmitted by 3 different systems. This is salary. There's also respect and esteem. And thirdly, we have promotion and job security. So the general idea is that the closer in balance your rewards are to your efforts, the more healthy and satisfied that you will be. So I've been using this approach in higher education. So just to report the findings very briefly, we have a situation where high efforts and low esteem rewards predict mental health problems. And I do need to say as well, sorry I missed saying that in the previous slide, that this model also has an individual difference component. And the idea is that effort rewards imbalance will actually be exaggerated in people who are really overcommitted to the job. You know, they are completely wedded to the job and very deeply involved in it. So high efforts, low esteem, and high overcommitment to the job predicted mental health problems over time. Secondly, we have high efforts, high overcommitment, and low esteem rewards again, you know, and people who were experiencing these conditions were more likely to have physical health problems. We then have predicting job dissatisfaction. And for job dissatisfaction, esteem is important, but also job security and salary. So it's really interesting, I think, that we can see that esteem seems to be really, really important for all of these vital outcomes in higher education staff. And leaving intentions was predicted again by low esteem, job insecurity, and low salary rewards. But the interesting thing about this model, as I mentioned, is that rewards can actually counterbalance efforts. And certainly what we would recommend in this situation would be to use something like appreciative inquiry or, you know, basically focus groups to ask people for suggestions on how rewards could actually be used to counterbalance efforts. And certainly some very creative interventions can be developed this way. Moving on now to another risk factor that we've identified in the sector, and this is something called change fatigue. Now, this may sound familiar to some of you, and it's defined as a sense of passive resignation or apathy to organisational changes. And you know, we've known for some time that change management is a major problem in lots of organisations, particularly higher education, because you know we've experienced a huge amount of change recently. So you know, the findings show that a high proportion of the sample, 60%, thought that too many changes have been introduced over time. 3/4 saw the extent of change as being overwhelming. 62% felt that they were seldom or never consulted about changes that actually affected them. And again, over 3/4 of the sample believed that a period of stability was required without any further change, perhaps a year where there were no major changes. And change fatigue was very strongly linked to the mental health of the sample. And certainly the extent to which they felt engaged in their job, satisfied, and thought they were doing a good performance. But one of the important things about change fatigue is that it can lead to something called learned helplessness, where people just give up. You know, they actually feel that whatever they do isn't going to make any difference, so they just give up. And that can then lead to resistance to changes that could be positive. So people would resist all forms of change. So change fatigue, again, is something that needs to be managed in the sector. Something else that has been documented for many years is something called role stress. Now, I've called it here role creep, and this is the idea that we wear too many hats. Now, there is evidence that extra role behaviours, you know, doing lots of different types of things, can provide variety and, you know, predict well-being. We saw in the sources of job satisfaction that variety of the job was very important indeed. And certainly it can strengthen working relationships because you're fulfilling different roles and you're working with different people. But of course, in higher education, there is no longer a very simple dichotomy between teaching and research. People tend to wear very, very many hats, including, you know, just a few here: pastoral care, entrepreneurial activities, etc. IT specialists, you know, having to deal with technology to teach, and also professional updating in your own area of research. And of course, we now have to demonstrate excellence in all of these domains, which can be a challenge. And certainly there is strong potential for this feeling of role overload, the feeling that the roles that you have to fulfill, somehow the demands conflict with each other, and even role ambiguity, where you're no longer sure what your role actually is. So again, that is something that has to be recognised. Something else that we were considering is something called illegitimate tasks, and these are the type of tasks that sit outside what we can reasonably be expected to do. These are the things that we think other people should do and not us. And the second element of this variable is something called unnecessary tasks, where we think they shouldn't actually be done at all. And certainly in our sample of academics, we found that half of the sample believe they perform tasks that are unreasonable often or frequently, and only 2% never actually do so. So the majority of people recognise this notion of unreasonable tasks. And again, half of the sample do tasks that make little sense, either often or frequently. And the reason why these illegitimate and unnecessary tasks are so powerful is that it does tend to violate our perception of role. You know, we think that we know what our role is, but when we have to do things like, you know, masses of photocopying, etc., that we believe other people should do, you know, that's just an example. It threatens our professional identity, which in turn impairs job satisfaction, health, and the extent to which we feel engaged in the role. And it kind of goes against the psychological contract. Moving on. Now, this is something that we did look at in the last survey, and presenteeism is only recently been looked at in a kind of scientific way. And certainly there is evidence accumulating that presenteeism, which really means that people continue to work when they are sick enough to take time off, it is a big problem in general. And it's not only more common than absenteeism, but considerably more costly. And it has been estimated that it can be up to 10% more costly, sorry, 10 times more costly than absenteeism. So we wanted to look at it in the higher education sector. So we asked people, how often do you continue to work when you're unwell? And we found that 79% do so at least sometimes, 27% often, and 22% always. And one thing, the other thing that we asked as well was the frequency to which people worked at home while they were off sick. And again, that was extremely common, and a similar proportion of people did that. Now, we got some qualitative data on the key reasons why people continue to work while they're sick, and also continue to work while they're off sick. And lots of different reasons, including the pressure of work, knowing that work, when they go back to work, will remain undone. So, you know, it'll be worse when they come back. Obligation, feelings of obligation to colleagues and students. If you think colleagues are going to be taking over your teaching, etc., and your marking, and also letting students down. Feelings of job insecurity, where you may be first in the firing line if there are any job losses in terms of your sick record, and also a very deep commitment to the job. You know, people were doing it because they really loved the work. And a few people actually said, well, you know, I get really bored if I'm not working. So even if I'm in hospital, or even if I'm sitting in A&E, which a few people did say, I will continue to work, because what else would I do, type of thing. But of course, we do need to be very aware of the risks of presenteeism, because there is evidence that although there may be short-term benefits in terms of, you know, retaining staffing, there are definitely long-term risks, because the evidence is that people tend to make errors, sometimes very serious errors, when they're not concentrating because they're sick, and also they tend to take more time off sick in the long run. So it may be seen as a viable short-term solution, but it certainly isn't over the long term. So just moving on now. Now, this is something that I've been looking at from the very early days of my research, and the general idea is that academics do tend to be very highly involved in what they do. And I can't remember who actually coined this phrase, the personal is the professional. You know, there is a thread, like a professional thread running through all areas of academics' life, and that's very common. And my research has found that Academics do tend to have, as I said, a very high integration between work and personal life. They tend to have very weak boundaries between work and personal life. You know, they may be writing a paper in bed, etc., marking on holiday. That tends to be the norm, and that does tend to be expected, if you like. There is some variation. You know, quite a few of my participants would prefer to stay in work and get their work done rather than work at home, whilst others would have like a seamless integration between work and their personal life. But what we've certainly found is it isn't the extent to which people's work is integrated or separated with their personal life. It's what they want. It's the fit between what they have and what they want. And it's that predicts mental health. And that's really what we should be working on, is helping people identify what they want and help them increase this fit. But however much separation or integration they have between work and personal life, there is evidence that people need some form of separation, because this allows them to recover mentally and physically, and then that predicts mental health and job satisfaction over time. But of course, in academia, there is a high risk of work-life conflict. You know, people may spend lots of their time doing work, and there's only 24 hours in the day. So, you know, that reduces the time available to do other things. But also this strain-based conflict where you wouldn't necessarily be doing the work, but you're actually thinking about it. You're ruminating, you're problem solving, if you like. And they both have implications for work-life balance and health over the long run. And certainly as part of the effort reward imbalance model I mentioned earlier, overcommitment is a key risk factor, and that can then lead to people working longer and harder over time, impacting on their work-life balance. Okay, now I said I was going to move on to something which was a relatively new hazard, and this is something that we've been looking at over the last couple of years. Certainly this notion that new technology like smartphones, computers, etc., laptops, iPads, people can take them wherever they want to, take them on holiday, etc. So this means that people, rather than use them to increase flexibility, which of course you can do, it means that you are always available. You're always available to read your emails, to send emails, etc. Some people may even read and send emails in the middle of the night. So we know from previous research that academics often access email flexibly. They prefer to choose where and when they access their email. But certainly that our research has found that this sense of being overloaded by email is very, very common, where people are feeling almost very panicky and anxious about their email. And the idea that thinking that people expect you to respond very rapidly, and this notion that, what's it called, inbox zero is going to happen. You know, you can work really, really hard, you can have no emails in your inbox, and then all of a sudden, you know, within 5 minutes, you've got 20. So one academic called this a Sisyphean task, which reflects the general view, I guess. But of course, if you are continuing to be engaged with work, it means that your work role is salient at all times. You're no longer having enough time to recover. You're flipping in and out of work mode almost constantly. So we found that increases the perceptions of work intensity. It also threatens personal relationships, because you may be physically present with somebody, but you may not necessarily be mentally present because you're kind of answering your emails. It also affects your job performance over time, because you know you don't have enough time to recover, and certainly affects your work-life balance. So what we found is we recommend that a systemic approach is needed, because you can't just put interventions in place for individuals, because they work with others. And an example, you know, if you have a senior manager who is sending an email at 7 o'clock on a Sunday morning, their staff is going to be thinking, well, you know, this is what's expected. So even though they may not necessarily be expected to respond, they'll feel that they have to. So, you know, one person's email management will impact on other people as well. But of course, one thing we found that emailing can take around about 2 hours of academics' working days sometimes, but it's not included in the workload model at all. So this can extend the working day considerably. And there is no guidance on healthy use. So at the moment, we're working on, and we've identified something called e-resilience. So we have a series of guidance tips, if you like, for individuals and organizations on how to manage email in a healthy and sustainable way. And if anybody's interested in that, please get in touch with me, because, we're very keen on validating this model. So I'm not going to go through these, you can look at these later. These are just some quotes from the interviews that we did. You can see the variation, because people sometimes prefer to access email at all times of the day. Some people may say we don't have any choice because we have too much. One of the favorites is we put an out of office notification on, but we read our emails anyway. Now, very, very many people do that, myself included, and that is something that we need to stop, because of course, we need to manage people's expectations. Okay, so just to finish now, all of this research that I'm drawing on, that I've been doing over the last 20 years, obviously we have to have some solutions. How do we improve well-being in higher education? So the idea is, we really must have evidence-informed interventions at each level, all the way down from public policy that supports well-being in universities, right down to organisations themselves, teams, and also individuals. So I'm now going to just give you some ideas of what can be done. Just going to pick a few of these out, because obviously it could take me forever to go through these. So obviously public policy, we need to encourage the sector, not just individual institutions, to do regular risk assessments using the Health and Safety Executives framework. We need to develop workable workload management initiatives, because they do tend to be very different, and things that are counted do tend to be very different according to different institutions. Certainly, we would recommend that there is a national network which is multidisciplinary, that disseminates what works. We need to know, we don't just need to know what goes wrong, we need to know what to do to actually make things better and share these. We need, at an organisational level, certainly our own research has found that stress does tend to be very heavily stigmatised in universities. So we need to build an open and honest culture that talks about stress openly. We need to manage workload and also recognise working hours, because many people work much longer and harder than they're seen, so they're doing it at work or elsewhere. So, we need a workload model that actually recognises all of the hours that people work. We need to ensure that efforts are balanced with rewards, as I mentioned earlier. Build support networks and mentorship schemes. One thing that we found is very important is to develop managers' skills in managing well-being in others. And that's something that we're working on at the moment. We should be aware of role creep, of role conflict and role overload, and how they can perhaps be a short-term solution, but really impair people's well-being over time and lead to retention issues. We must prioritise work-life balance and self-care. We must recognise the role of overcommitment too, because people's love and passion for their job can sometimes be their undoing, where they do not allow themselves sufficient time to recover, and they're unable to actually sustain this level of performance. And also an organisation that promotes e-resilience, that realises that being always on is actually counterproductive, so encourages people to switch off. But obviously we do have to have knowledge of how individuals can be resilient, because that is a responsibility as well. We all need to take steps to be resilient ourselves. So resilient individuals manage stress effectively. They prioritise their own self-care. They switch off. They have effective boundary management. They practice mindfulness. Now that's something that perhaps you could consider. But also they accept and provide support, and I think that's very important indeed. So just moving on briefly, finishing with these top tips for managers, and I'm a firm believer in top tips because it's something that perhaps you could all consider to make changes that could be fairly small but could have a big impact. And I think it's very important to acknowledge that the staff experience is as important as the student experience. You know, many people that we spoke to thought that their own well-being was seen as far less important, if you like. It's important to monitor well-being over time using perhaps the health and safety executive's approach, but also to capture new challenges. You know, as I mentioned, the technology, the being always on, and having regular surveys and focus groups in your organization. This approach is never finished. It's a continual process of monitoring, adjustment, intervention, and change. So avoid shopping around, because many institutions keep on changing their surveys. They may have an employee well-being survey, but they're asking different questions every single time. And obviously different companies will use different measures, and we must have validated measures. Very, very important indeed. And we must be able to measure them year on year and compare them. We also need to disseminate the findings widely. Certainly, some institutions have actually been quite reluctant to publicize the findings of their well-being surveys because perhaps, you know, they haven't been very positive. But certainly we found that that is extremely important, and you know, standing up there with your hands on your heart and saying, actually, we've got this wrong. This is something we need to work on. You'll certainly get the hearts and minds of employees. Restore effort, reward balance and control. And I think I mentioned that, you know, thinking about how to do this via action research, asking people in which way could your effort reward balance be restored. Provide guidance on healthy technology use, and also encourage innovation. Ask people what they do to manage technology in a healthy way, and you know, share these findings. Train line managers to promote well-being, and that's something that we're working on at the moment using a knowledge, skills and abilities framework, and I'd be happy to share that. You know, I'm working with social workers, but I think there's certainly some similarities in different sectors. Promote evidence-based self-care initiatives. Certainly, you know, there are some initiatives around that do not have an evidence base, and it's very important to share these effective techniques. Something else that we would recommend, and I've been working on recently, is consider setting up a peer coaching scheme. And this is where people are coaching each other. It can be face-to-face, it can be on the phone. And they are of equal status, and they're turning a problem into a solution by using their signature strengths. And again, I'd be more than happy to share some information on that, because it's a very, very low cost and very effective technique. It also interests me the number of institutions that actually go outside to get their information on staff well-being. Well, what you do tend to find is that there may be a lot of expertise within your institution, and perhaps they could have a very important input. And I think above all, you know, to get the hearts and minds of people is avoid relying on individually focused initiatives, because, you know, that isn't something that will be very beneficial. I'm not saying that people do not need these skills. Of course they do. We all need to know how to unwind from a stressful job. But, you know, there should be strategic change as well to balance that out. Okay, so I'm finishing now with some resources that you may find useful. And obviously, if anybody wants to get in touch with me, I would welcome that. And I can talk to people offline. Thank you very much.
Gail, that's tremendous. Thank you so much. There is so much there. We've got about
Sorry.
10 minutes left. I know it's wonderful. I mean, whoa. So I'll shut up. Colleagues, questions, comments. Don't forget, if you're going to speak, to turn your microphone on or say something in the chat box.
Okay. I think I've got my microphone on, haven't I?
You have, yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm thinking about my colleagues who've had theirs turned off.
Oh, sorry. I thought you were talking to me. I'm totally sorry.
No. So I've got a question from Joy saying, thank you so much. I'm curious about the email model proposed and also the research finding 2 hours on average for academic use.
Well, obviously there's going to be a huge variation among people. So I'm just going back to that. Yes, there's going to be a huge variation, and certainly the type of discipline that people work in as well is very important, because some people are out or perhaps in the classroom all day. So the times that they have to engage with email is going to be out of hours. So, you know, that's something that does need to be incorporated into a workload model to recognize that, because, you know, to my knowledge, I'm not aware of any university that does that. Maybe some people are.
Got a question from Lorraine. Thank you, a really excellent summary. Could you give an example of an intervention that could be carried out to deal with presenteeism in an organization?
Oh, that's a good one. I'm working on that at the moment. Could we perhaps talk about that offline? Because I think there's lots of, I've written a couple of papers on this recently, and I think it's very kind of sector dependent, and it's very individual dependent as well. So I think I'd probably end up talking for a very long time about that. So if you wouldn't mind getting in touch with me, that would be quite useful. But certainly there does have to be some interventions about presenteeism, because, you know, I was talking to people that actually one person was in a hospital bed in Singapore because he'd been out, you know, doing some work for his university, collapsed with a very, very serious illness and ended up marking from his hospital bed, you know, and it wasn't that anybody was telling him to do that. It was because the work was there and had to be done, you know.
Yeah.
So the work becomes much more salient than anything else. So in some ways we're our own worst enemy, if that makes sense. So it isn't just the organization, it's the individual as well.
When we're offline, I'll tell you a story about my deciding not to have a heart attack test, but to go to a meeting instead. That's a story.
Yeah, that's very familiar. Absolutely.
Jenny's asked the question: do you know of any institutions that have adopted your top tips, and what was the result?
Right. Again, I think it would probably be more useful to talk to somebody offline. We're particularly keen on this type of e-resilience intervention at the moment, and actually, yes, I can share that. What we found was we encouraged one department in one university in England to encourage the staff to switch off at 5 o'clock, you know, don't engage with email, etc. And I'm afraid there was uproar, because people wanted the latitude, you know, they wanted the flexibility to engage with email when they wanted to. So solutions in some sectors may not work necessarily in academia. Where you have expectations of high control, I think that can be an issue. But, you know, we're certainly working on all of these, and I think I'd need to think more before I shared the information. Yeah.
Question from Len: did you find an increasing admin workload with academics needing to be their own one-stop shop?
I'm not entirely sure I understand that.
So that they're having to do more, they have to be more responsible for themselves. So rather than being able to refer things to other people, they're having to become more flexible in finding solutions themselves.
Right. Provided they were given sufficient control and provided the demands weren't too great. I think those two things are really, really important, because control can offset demand, because of course, you know, you can work out ways of fulfilling the demands quite creatively if you've got control. But above a certain level, if demands become too high, no matter how much control you have, you know, you're not able to fulfill them. And sometimes I think if people have excessively high expectations of coping, that can be a major problem, because sometimes people can be their own worst enemy. It's not the organization that's telling them, you know, to work longer and harder. It's their own standards. And that can be a massive, massive problem in higher education, certainly.
Yeah, one of the thoughts that occurred to me was what implications TEF has had and TEF 3 will continue to have for the work that you're doing. I was struck by, for example, the addition of intensity to the TEF 3 criteria, which can only put more work onto staff.
Well, absolutely, that's the thing. And it's very difficult to count hours, to count working hours. You know, you may say to somebody, and I've done this in terms of interventions for, you know, to increase health and well-being. You get people to write down what they do and when they do it. But including everything, you know, what do you include? Do you include reading that academic paper when you're on the train going somewhere? You know, what is work and what isn't? And that's the idea of having the personal and the professional intertwined in lots of ways.
Yeah.
It's quite difficult to estimate your workload, and we need to be better at it, really, because the workload models don't pick up a lot of what we do very well.
Yeah. Yes, we've noticed that with the CRA, with the personal tutoring work that we're doing. When does a personal tutor stop being a personal tutor?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, because there's a huge amount of intrinsic motivation and satisfaction in this type of work. And people work because they want to, as you know, obviously, as well as because they need to. So it's very difficult to say to people, if you don't switch off, you won't be able to do this for very long. Yes. Because of course you're getting satisfaction from what you do, but what you're doing is you're draining your batteries at the same time. Yeah. If that makes. And before you know it, you know, you may be suffering from a stress-related illness, and you're just unable to carry on for a while. Yes. So having regular breaks, doing something different, resting the systems that you use at work, which is what we recommend. You know, that's really what you need to do. Yes. But sometimes people may be reluctant to hear the message.
Got one final question. Would you be happy to share your slides with us?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
I know that we're going to get this as a recording, but also that some of the details of the slides was a bit small. So if people had the slides, they could follow it up.
Oh, absolutely.
It's not a problem. But it's, yes. That was smashing. Thank you very much.
Yes.
Yes, I'm just. It only leaves me to say thank you so much for another stonking webinar. That's absolutely brilliant.
Thank you. That's very nice. Well, I hope everybody else got something from it. There's another message that I've got here, but obviously we haven't got time to go through that.
No, go and say it. Say it.
Something about having an auto response when people are on holiday. Yes, I think that's a really good idea, and I do know of a colleague in a different institution that does that, but sometimes universities would not allow people to do that. But certainly I do know of somebody that does it, and she's a psychologist with expertise in computing, and she gets away with it, but I don't think maybe other institutions may be horrified about the idea. But it's something that perhaps could be explored.
The Oliver Bergman column on a Saturday in The Guardian has been for years blatting on about doing emails in batches rather than having them switched on all the time.
Yes, yes.
having the message that you're not going to reply to emails straight away, but you will see your emails 2 or 3 times a day.
Yes, absolutely. That's fine, because what you're doing is you're managing people's expectations. But I think what this person was suggesting was that when you're on leave, any emails that you get are deleted completely.
Deleted, yes.
Yeah, and then, you know, the messages said something like, well, if you've still got a problem in 2 weeks' time or a week, you know, please get in touch with me or something.
Yes.
So, you know, that can work in other sectors, but, you know, I think we do need to be much better at email management, because otherwise it will take over our lives.
Indeed, indeed. Gail, once more, thank you so much. It's been so lovely to see you again.
No problem. I hope people found it useful. Okay, take care then.
Sure that they have your email address because of your kind offer to be in touch offline.
Oh, if you could, that would be lovely. Yeah, because I'm always happy to talk to people who are interested in my research. Thank you.
Marvelous. Thanks, Gail. Ta-da, everybody. Thanks a lot for coming.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.